Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. This episode marks the beginning of the 2024 spooky APHOUT season. I mean, most of my episodes are very Halloween friendly, but the next bunch of episodes are definitely more focused on all the things we love about Halloween and the fall in general. Ghouls, vampires, demons, witches, and ghosts. I mean, we all love that stuff the most, right? It's not just me. And for those of you watching these episodes on YouTube, you'll be treated to a new spooky APHOUT episode every Sunday for the entirety of the season, so it's the best time of the year. Now, to start it all off, I wanted to look at the king of toxic, morally gray men himself, Dracula. Now, whether it was through Count Chocula, the Count on Sesame Street, or Castlevania, or maybe with actors like Bela Lugosi, or Christopher Lee, or Gary Oldman, or even recently Nicolas Cage, we've all seen at least one iteration of Dracula in pop culture. He's unavoidable. He's everywhere, right? And he's also intensely studied by historians trying to learn more about where he comes from. And no, I'm not suggesting that Dracula, the vampire, is real. Instead, I'm talking about whether or not Dracula was based on Vlad Dracula, also sometimes called Vlad the Impaler. Vlad was, well, he had quite an interesting life, actually, but he's most known as the ruthless ruler of Wallachia, who impaled his victims and hung them on spikes. And most assume that Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, based his vampire on Vlad. I mean, they do share the name Dracula. But not everyone is convinced, and it's still a topic of conversation and debate today. So what I want to do is give a history of Vlad the Impaler, because what a name, am I right? And once we get a good sense of who Vlad is, then I'll give my take on whether or not Bram Stoker's Dracula is supposed to be a more romanticized version of Vlad. Or do they just happen to share a name and have nothing else in common? As always, I'll start with some historical context. What did Vlad the Impaler's world look like? The Balkans in the mid to late 15th century, that's the 1400s. It's important because Vlad's actions and his legacy are absolutely a reflection of the world he lived in, so the context is super important here. Then, once we've got that covered, we'll talk about Vlad's life and how he earns the moniker the Impaler. And then we'll see if we can connect him to the fictional Dracula. So let's get started. I'm going to start with a bit of a disclaimer here. The world of the 15th century Balkans and more generically Eastern Europe is super intricate and political, so as I normally do, I'm just going to focus on the big picture stuff, the bigger forces and events happening within the 15th century. I mean, what can I say? I'm a big picture historian. I like looking at big sweeping changes and how they affect things, which is why I like disease history so much. Then if we're talking about Eastern Europe in the 1400s, then we have to talk about the fall of Constantinople and the spread of Islam into Eastern Europe. From the 1200s onwards, a group known as the Ottoman Turks migrated to Anatolia, the area that would later become Turkey. This area was also populated by the Byzantines, an empire that served as the vestiges of the Roman Empire, at least the eastern half of the Roman Empire, until its collapse in 1453. But by the end of the 1200s, the empire was already in pretty severe decline. It had been in decline for hundreds of years by that point, but one particularly brutal moment was the Fourth Crusade, where Catholic crusaders sacked and pillaged Orthodox Constantinople in yet another attempt at reclaiming the Holy Land from the Muslims. Quick historical side tangent, because the question needs to be asked and addressed: why would Christians sack a Christian city? The whole point of the Crusades, on paper, and if we simplify it, was for Christians to recover the Holy Land from the Muslims, right? Well, like I talk about a lot with some of these European episodes where both Protestants and Catholics are involved, just because Catholicism and Orthodoxy are both forms of Christianity, it doesn't mean that they get along. And part of the reason that these Catholic crusaders sacked Constantinople is because of these religious differences and also the distrust that they caused. And they also wanted money promised to them and believed that the Byzantines were treacherous when they didn't pay out. So, after the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was on a serious decline. And when the Ottoman Turks start knocking on the door in the late 13th century, things don't look so good for the Byzantines. In 1453, a very pivotal year in world history, the Ottomans under Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, besieged the city. And if after a little less than 2 months of constant cannon bombardment, they broke through the walls and captured the city, and the Byzantine Empire was now over. In the years that followed, the Ottoman Turks pushed even further into Europe, eventually culminating in the Battle of Vienna in 1683. That's right, over 200 years after the fall of Constantinople. And yes, Vienna as in Austria. This battle marks the furthest that the Ottomans pushed into Europe, which is pretty far if you think about it. So, as you can imagine, in the 200 plus years from conquering Constantinople, turning it into Istanbul, and working their way up to Vienna, there were many battles between the Europeans and the Turks. Now, it may not have factored much into, say, English politics, right? But it was certainly an everyday threat for those in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and a general existential threat to Christians and Catholics everywhere. And this is the world that Vlad Dracula was born into. He was born in Transylvania before the fall of Constantinople, but when Ottoman power and political influence was strong. And it goes beyond this. Vlad was even an Ottoman hostage for most of his childhood. So, let's dig a little bit deeper here into Vlad's history to get a good sense of who he was and how he later became known as the Impaler. A quick aside. What's kind of fun is that I did an episode about a member of the Eastern European nobility who is historically known for being bloody and evil and violent and intense. It was the Blood Countess Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian killer who they said bathed in the blood of virgins. I mean, Bathory was bad, but she didn't bathe in the blood of virgins, at least not that we can prove with actual evidence. I did an episode on her a long way back, so go check that one out if you haven't already done so. But what rings true in both Vlad's 15th century Romanian story and the Blood Countess's 16th century Hungarian one is the political instability present in both. These were times where leaders might rule for mere weeks before being chased out and potentially killed. It was tense, and that was certainly true for Vlad's family. Vlad II, father to Vlad the Impaler, ruled Wallachia as a voivode between 1436 to 1442, and then again between 1443 to 1447. A voivode is the Slavic term for a local ruler, think like a prince or a duke. Now, Wallachia, in today's Romania, was at the time sandwiched between Hungary to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the south. Though Constantinople didn't fall until 1453, the Ottomans were still in and around the Balkans, and they forced Wallachia to serve them as a tributary state in 1417. See? What did I tell you? Super complicated stuff. But anyways, Vlad II was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He had to be allied to the Ottomans, but he also wanted to be rid of them. To that end, he joined an organization known as the Order of the Dragon, which is way cooler than the Order of the Pug. Do you see what I mean about the name Pug for Order of the Pug? The Order of the Dragon makes me think Game of Thrones, or House of the Dragon. It's just so much cooler. But anyways, I'm telling you this because this is where the word Dracula comes from. Vlad II was so pumped by his membership in this organization to help remove the Ottomans from the Balkans that he took the moniker Vlad Dracula, which means Vlad the Dragon. Dracul comes from the Latin word for dragon, Draco. Draco? Draco Malfoy? I'm gonna go with Draco. His second son, Vlad, or Vlad III, ended up as Vlad Dracula, or son of Dracul, son of the dragon, which is almost as cool as Vlad the Impaler. Lots of fun names for him. Oh, and while I'm on the subject, we call him Vlad the Impaler, but he wasn't given that sobriquet until way after his death by an Ottoman writer named Tursun Beg, who referred to him in the Turkish as Kazik Voivoda, or Impaler Lord, which is a cool epithet and a really great metal band name. Impaler Lord. I like it. Now, despite being part of the Order of the Dragon, Vlad II still had to toe the line with the Ottomans. At one point, the Ottoman leader Murad II invited Vlad to come to his court, and Vlad brought along his two younger boys, Vlad III and Radu. All three of them were arrested because going there was a poor choice, and after some time, Murad decides to send Papa Vlad back with the understanding that he will be properly loyal to the Ottomans going forward. And how is Murad going to ensure this? By keeping his sons as hostages in the Ottoman court. This is a thing we see with other civs too. The Inca did the same thing. Keep the heirs of local leaders at their capital in Cusco for the Inca to ensure their loyalty. And if you aren't loyal and you don't do what the emperor wants, the heirs die. It's pretty effective strategy. But noble hostage children like this, in most empires and situations, for both the Inca and for Vlad over in the Ottoman Empire, they're at least given an education. So Vlad III was taught things like science and technology and history and military strategy, among very many other things, including some Turkish. Now, Vlad II, Papa Vlad, he goes back to rule over Wallachia, but he was quickly chased out by a rival and was killed. The oldest son, Mircea, was also killed around this time in a battle, so Vlad III, is now set to inherit Wallachia, though it's not as simple as a basic line of succession. Anyone could rise to power and claim the seat, which is part of the reason why Balkan medieval politics is so messy, but so interesting. Anyways, Vlad III ended up back in Wallachia and took power in 1448 through a bloody coup and some help from Ottoman forces. Sure, he was their hostage and didn't particularly like them for it, but he was also shrewd enough to know that he needed Ottoman help, at least in this situation, to get power back, and he ruled for a little under a month before he was chased out of power. He would end up ruling 3 separate times, but it was his second reign, from 1456 to 1462, where we start to see some of the actions that would eventually earn him the reputation as the Impaler. After he was chased out of Wallachia during his first brief reign, he took shelter in Moldavia, today's Moldova, and later Hungary under the powerful regent John Hunyadi. They had a complicated relationship, but Hunyadi ended up helping Vlad regain the Wallachian voivodeship in 1456. It's interesting that Vlad would use both the Ottomans the first time and the Hungarians the second time to get control of Wallachia. It gives you an idea of how messy politics, rivalries, and alliances were. I mean, at various points he was allied with or enemies of both the Ottomans and the Hungarians. And remember that Wallachia was sandwiched between the two, so there was no ignoring one or the other. You had to play the political game. To survive in this kind of world, Vlad Dracula figured he had to be tough and ruthless. And he gathered some of his infamy in how he survived for 6 years in this kind of unstable political climate. He would execute noblemen who didn't perform their duties properly or were insubordinate. He went to war against neighbors to take land outside of Wallachia, like Transylvania. But of course, the most notorious thing about him was his preferred method of torture and execution: impalement. Which, if you're not completely sure how that looks or how that works, it's where a pole, sometimes blunt, sometimes spiked, would be inserted into your backside and forcefully shoved up until it popped and burst through all of your internal organs and then came out through the mouth. And this happened while you were alive, normally. A good example, anyway, not just of the impalement, but a good example of how he was so ruthless, we can look at his Danube campaign. In 1462, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, yes, the same one that conquered Constantinople, Mehmed the Conqueror, called Vlad to his court. But Vlad had done that before, right? Vlad was captured when he was a boy, and his dad went to kind of do the same thing to Murad II. So, weary of doing this, He instead decided to impale one of Mehmed's chieftains and 40 of his men along the river Danube, lining the walls of Târgoviște, his capital, with their mutilated bodies. From there, Vlad marched across the frozen Danube to today's Bulgaria and destroyed every town, city, and army that wasn't Wallachian, whether they be Turks or anyone else. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. They either died by the sword or were burned alive. And according to Vlad Dracula himself, he estimates around 22,883 people died on the Danube campaign, and those were just the ones he accounted for. He also destroyed infrastructure, goods, boats, carts, houses, churches, forts, basically leaving the remaining people with nothing they could use to rebuild and no economy. It also made sure that the Ottomans couldn't use that stuff either, the old scorched earth policy. Now, Mehmed's army came for Vlad, crossing the Danube in June of 1462. The Turks couldn't raid the local towns thanks to Vlad's scorched earthing, so they had a hard time on the campaign. But when Mehmed and his men reached Târgoviște at the end of the month, they expected to see Vlad Dracula waiting for them in his capital. Instead, they saw a deserted town littered with the impaled corpses of men and women, boys and girls, Christians and Muslims, all different ethnicities and nationalities, including some Hungarians. Sources give different accounts of what happened next. One says that Mehmed was confused by what he saw, but he also didn't want to deprive the Wallachian people of a cruel yet competent leader, so he just turned around and left. Another source claims that he was so sickened by the sight of these impaled bodies, including so many Turks, that he left from there. But regardless of the truth, Mehmed did retreat from Târgoviște, and he tried other tactics to instead keep power over the lands, including using Vlad's brother, Radu, to help negotiate and persuade the nobles to accept Ottoman rule. Radu was also known as Radu the Handsome, and he stayed on from his hostage ship in the Ottoman Empire as a member of the court. There were also some rumors that he was the lover of, it might have been Mehmed, but those are just rumors. But apparently he was quite handsome. Compared to Vlad. Vlad's picture is less handsome. The Ottomans were still very much pushing into the Balkans. I mean, if we take a step back and remember that the Battle of Vienna in 1683 was the furthest they made it into Europe, then we know that the Ottomans do eventually carry on from the Danube campaign, right? But for Vlad's story, things start to unravel after the Danube situation. He found himself with fewer and fewer noble friends. Some had defected to the Ottoman side, and perhaps others were turned off by his cruelty and wanton killing of Christian innocents and shoving poles up backsides and out through the mouth. I mean, it's not how you make friends, in case you didn't know. Now, Vlad ended up leaving the throne in 1462 and taking refuge in the Carpathian Mountains, appealing to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus for support. But instead of finding a friend, he was imprisoned. And we don't know too much about this time in prison because the records are kind of unreliable, but we do know that he was likely treated more like how he was treated as a hostage in the Ottoman Empire all those years ago, because he apparently took a wife and owned a house in Pest while imprisoned. And in 1475, Vlad was released from his captivity and encouraged to once again take over Wallachia, this time with Hungarian support. In 1476, Vlad and another voivode sieged Sabatz and later Srebrenica in today's Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, respectively, where we get even more information about his cruelty. In addition to the normal looting and pillaging, he would apparently rip the flesh, skin, and sinew from his Ottoman enemies with his bare hands before impaling them on stakes and leaving their bodies to rot and terrorize everybody in like a mile radius. I can imagine it was pretty stinky too. I imagine everything smelled like death all of the time. Now, he reclaimed power over Wallachia that same year in November 1476, but was quickly attacked by some rivals working under the Ottomans. Details don't exactly agree on what happened, but Vlad Dracula died in that battle. He was decapitated, and his head, preserved in honey, was sent to Mehmed II, where reportedly it was paraded around in the streets. That gives us an idea of how powerful he was that the Ottomans would celebrate in this way on his death, right? Like, that's clearly he was a big deal, and at least very much feared. Now, curiously, and what is so often the case with stories of these depraved, infamous, bloodthirsty rulers, much of what we know about Vlad the Impaler and his cruelty comes from biased sources written well after the fact, or by his enemies. Take this pamphlet, written in 1488, a little more than a decade after Vlad's death. It's titled Prince Dracula, and was printed in Germany. And much like what we saw with the Werewolf of Bedburg pamphlet, the one that was supposedly an English translation of an old German one that never existed, much like that pamphlet, it gets worse and more fantastical the further in you read. Here are some of the highlights from that source in no particularly curated order. Quote, "He was appointed lord in Wallachia. Immediately, he had villages in Transylvania burned. Both women and men, young and old, perished. Some he brought home with him to Wallachia and impaled them there. He commanded that all young boys who were sent to his lands to learn the language be confined in a chamber, and he had them burned. There were 400. He had some of his people buried naked up to the navel and had them shot at. He also had some roasted and flayed. He also had St. Bartholomew's Church burned and all vestments and chalices taken from there. He had a large pot made and boards with holes fastened over it, and had people's heads shoved through there and imprisoned them thus. And he had the pot filled with water, and a big fire made under the pot, and thus let the people cry out pitiably until they were boiled to death. He devised dreadful, frightful, unspeakable torments, such as impaling together mothers and children nursing at their breasts, so that the children kicked convulsively at their mothers' breasts until dead. In like manner he cut open mothers' breasts and stuffed their children's head through, and thus impaled both. He had captured a gypsy who had stolen. Then the other gypsies came and begged Dracula to release him. Then he said, 'He must hang, and you must execute him yourselves.' They said it was not their custom. So Dracula had the gypsy boiled in a pot. Then the other gypsies were made to eat his flesh and bones. He had a mistress who pretended she was pregnant. Then Dracula had the woman examined by midwives, who said she was not pregnant. Then he cut this same mistress open right up to her breasts, and he said he wanted to see where his seed was or where it had been. And finally, he had children roasted. These their mothers had to eat, and he cut the woman's breasts off. These their husbands had to eat, and afterward he had them all impaled." End quote. There are more, of course, but we can't be here all day, so you're welcome to find and read the text of this source online if you want the full picture. There are actually 6 copies of this pamphlet that still exist today, one of which is in the US at the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philly. I've put a link to the UPenn page where I read the translation of this source in the description if you're interested in reading it for yourself. Now, there is also a pretty famous German woodcut from circa 1560 showing Vlad sitting and eating on a field next to a whole bunch of impaled victims. Tasty. It may depict an event known as the Bloody Easter, which supposedly took place on March 25th, 1459. Vlad had called 500 boyars, which are nobles, to his court for a meal, and once they were fed and fattened up, he had his guards drag each of the 500 men outside, and one by one they were impaled on a stake until they bled to death. But by all accounts, this was just a myth, not a real event, just more anti-Vlad propaganda. So the German sources clearly want to paint the picture that Vlad Dracula terrorized everyone in and around Wallachia, not just his enemies, but that he killed innocents on a whim, right? And if the vampiric Count Dracula is based on Vlad the Impaler, it's clearly based on this exaggerated version of him. Now, not everyone saw Vlad Dracula as this horrible, cruel warrior who went around shoving poles up his enemies' backsides. I mean, he did do that, but he wasn't always seen as a villain, is my point. In fact, to some local Romanian sources, Vlad is seen as a hero, a man who defended his people from the Ottomans, and also the Hungarians, and also some German Anglo-Saxon Catholics who wanted to control the mostly Orthodox Wallachia. Sources are biased in both ways, both for him as a hero of the people and against him as a cruel and vicious murderer. It's also true that regardless of how it's spun, both types of sources see that he was a pretty cruel man who did indeed impale a lot of people. But of course, in this modern age, a lot of what we associate with Vlad and his rule is what we get from Bram Stoker's Dracula. For those of you who haven't read the book, here is a brief summary of the original story. An English lawyer, Jonathan Harker, is en route to Castle Dracula in Transylvania because he's delivering paperwork for the sale of a property in England to the Count. The Transylvanian peasants seem scared of the castle and of the Count Dracula, but Harker just goes on anyway because he's got a job to do. Cue all of the normal horror stuff. It's dark out, wolves are howling, etc., etc. Count Dracula is presented as a pale, thin, strange, gaunt man who reacts strangely to blood. Harker cut himself shaving in the mirror, and Dracula goes for the throat to drink the blood. Harker realizes that he's in trouble, he's imprisoned there, and he finds out that Dracula survives by drinking human blood, and so he realizes that he is likely going to be killed to feed Dracula. Harker tries to kill him, but fails, and is left weak and sickly. Back home in England, Harker's fiancée Mina is worrying about him. And after, long story short and simplified here, Dracula comes to England via a ship carrying a bunch of dirt from Castle Dracula, 50 boxes of them. Dracula survives by feeding off of Mina's friend, Lucy, who is turning into a vampire herself. She's killed by Van Helsing, a doctor, and later a stake is driven through her heart to end her properly. And that's when they discover that's how you kill vampires. Jonathan comes back from Transylvania and marries Mina, but soon Mina becomes Dracula's new target. To save her, they have to find all of those boxes of dirt, which is how Dracula can survive in England, and destroy them. They do all of them but one. The last box is sent back to Transylvania. They follow it. Jonathan Harker cuts off Dracula's head. Another guy puts a stake through his heart. End of story, Dracula's dead. So, other than the name Dracula, there's not too much of a direct connection to Vlad the Impaler. The Transylvania thing also doesn't read, by the way. Sure, he was born there, it's part of his history, but Vlad was the thrice voivode of Wallachia, not the Count of Transylvania. And also there aren't counts in that area, that's not what they're called. Historians, history buffs, and fans of mythology and fiction over the years have done a lot of research into how the two are related, if at all. Some suggest that Bram Stoker got the name Dracula from history books on Wallachia. Others claim that Stoker learned about Vlad from a Hungarian professor and built his story off of that. He did include some references to Vlad's life in his novel, like the Danube campaign, so that helped tie the two together a little bit. I've read that the vampire stuff could connect to Vlad's general bloodthirstiness, taken literally for the novel, or that the act of stabbing a stake through the heart is another way of impaling. I mean, certainly there can be some lines drawn between the real-life Vlad the Impaler and the fictional Dracula, but there's really not much to go on. My take is that Bram Stoker very loosely based the character off of this really infamous Wallachian ruler, taking some names and places that stood out to him, but making the character very much his own. He's not supposed to be Vlad, he's just loosely based on things surrounding Vlad's life. One source I read mentions that by his own admission, Bram Stoker knew very little about Vlad the Impaler. He was just inspired by a recent article about vampires in Transylvania and wanted to write a good novel about it. The vampire in question wasn't even called Dracula at first. He was originally known as Count Vampire. And if we take a step back and we look at the context, we see that vampirism and vampire folklore were growing trends in the early 18th century in Europe onwards. I even did an episode on the vampire panic in New England, where a girl named Mercy Brown was accused of being a vampire and killing her family off, even though they actually all died from consumption. But anyway, go watch that one. And in that episode, I provided the historical context for vampirism in Europe in the 18th to 19th centuries. People thought they were seeing vampires everywhere, so it makes sense that Bram Stoker would write about a vampire, but use a touch of real history to give his story an edge. But what that ended up doing was clouding the real history of Vlad the Impaler and replacing it with fictional elements. I suppose it also led to an interest in Romanian and more generically Balkan history, which is cool, but it's important to separate fact from fiction when we look into characters like Vlad the Impaler who have seemingly been immortalized forever, like Dracula himself, into legends based off of things he didn't actually do. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the original Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and subscribe to APHOUT on YouTube. You should also go check out Nedrick, my editor and the musician behind my intro and outro song, Yellow Cake. You can find his stuff wherever you listen to music. Links to all of those things are in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.